Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at another harmonization of Nun Lab, mein Seel den Herren, which translates to, now praise my soul, the Lord. We're going to see a lot of similarities in comparison to yesterday's chorale, but this chorale does have its own unique profile, namely the time signature, and some of the harmonic progressions are a little quirky in terms of the inversions that are used and also how Bach approaches some of the chords, but really not a ton to write home about. A couple of key instances. This is another 2-pager, but do bear in mind the fact that it's in 3/4, so the measures are shorter. Let's hop into the analysis. So we have we have nothing in the key signature. We start on C major and we end on C major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is C major. We move from C major to A minor, A, E, A, and C, which is our 6th chord, passing tone in the tenor. That then takes us to E minor, E, G, G, and B. Some transitive harmony to start off this chorale, just like yesterday's. Transitive harmony is a term that I've been using to describe chords that go against the cycle of falling fifths, typically chords that we would expect in tonal music to, we would expect them to move a 5th down or a 4th up rather than a 5th up or a 4th down. So typically 3 goes to 6, but here we see 6 going to 3, and I've been calling that transitive harmony because you could use the same voice leading to go in either direction. There really is no normative cycle of falling fifths according to Bach. It's just they're a 5th apart, therefore they can be progressed between. That takes us to our 4 chord, F major, F, F, C, and A. Little passing tone here in the alto before we get C major, C, E, E, and G. It's our tonic triad. Passing tone in the alto again. We then have E, C, G, and C, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. We then have F, C, A, and D. D minor 7 over F. We know that Bach loves 2, 6, 5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. We then have G major, G, B, G, and D. It's our 5 chord. And then we cadence on C major, our tonic C, C, G, and E. This is an imperfect authentic cadence. Next phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and we briefly visit the key of A minor here. You might see this melodic minor fragment, which indicates to me that we've modulated, but we do end the phrase in the key of C major, so we will move back to the key we departed from. So we start with another C major chord. We don't need to reanalyze. I do think that's our common chord to the key of A minor. We do see quite a bit of movement from 3 to 5 in this chorale, so this progression might look a little quirky at first because 3 to 5 is a relatively uncommon progression, but in this chorale it is used with quite a bit of frequency. So that takes us to E major over G sharp, B, B, and E, which is 5, 6. And then we get F sharp, C, A, and E, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5. That's a byproduct of the melodic minor scale, just spelling a root position 6 chord with that raised 6 turns it from like an F major 7 chord to an F minor 7 or F sharp minor 7 flat 5 chord. And that takes us to E major in root position, or E7 rather, E, D, G sharp, and E. It's an incomplete 5/7 chord, but that's okay. We have the 7th, the root, and the 3rd. This progression is pretty interesting. We typically would expect a D major chord or a D7 chord here in first inversion, 5, 6, 4, 6, 5 in root position. That pattern is very common in Bach. We typically see it with 1 and 7 going to 1, 6 or the retrograde, but here we see a root position chord rather than a first inversion chord, a diatonic step below the outer chords in the progression. So it's a little interesting take on one of the patterns that Bach uses a lot to traverse a third by stepwise motion. So that takes us to A minor, A, C, A, and E, which is our tonic triad and also our submediant in the key of C major. We then have G, C, E, and E, which is C major in second inversion, 1, 6, 4. F is a little passing tone in the alto. We then get F, B, G, and D, which is 5, 4, 2. And we would expect this to go to 1, 6, E, C, G, and C, which it does. And this is another interesting take. Like here we have a take on the pattern where instead of getting a first inversion chord where the bass is the third of the chord, we get a root position chord, and it's basically the same pattern where Bach is traversing a third, like the distance from G sharp to E, with that passing chord there, or that intermediary chord. Bach is doing the same thing here. However, instead of a first inversion going to a root position chord, we have a second inversion going to a first inversion chord, and instead of seeing a first inversion chord, we are seeing a third inversion 5 chord rather than a second inversion 7 chord. So typically we would expect in this, or if I were to have made an educated guess on what chord would go in between a 1-6-4 going to a 1-6 chord, if I had F in the bass and Bach were writing it, I would expect a 7-6-4 chord because of that same logic that I've deducted from chord progressions I've seen in the past. But regardless, it's pretty interesting that they're in such close proximity to one another. This D here is an anticipation, and then we get another D minor 7 over F chord. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts, F, C, A, and D. And then we get another G major chord, 5, G, B, G, and D, with an anticipation in the melody again, leading us to C major, C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Next cadence is a deceptive cadence in the key of A minor. And again, we see a modulation to A minor where we move from 3 to a dominant functioning chord. So we start off with C major, we don't need to reanalyze. We then have F, A, F, and C, which is our 4 chord in the key of C major. Then we have some passing tones going on here in the tenor and the melody, which gives us F, B, F, and D, which is kind of like a passing B diminished chord over F, so I'll say 7-6-4 there. 4 going to 7 is a very common subdivided chord progression, but the thing with 3-4 or triple meter chorales is that a subdivided chord progression, it's not as clear as where subdivision is happening in comparison to duple meter chorales, where typically a progression is subdivided if we see eighth notes. Here we see that there isn't a regular harmonic rhythm. Sometimes it's on beat 1 and beat 3, sometimes it's on all of the beats, and typically Bach mixes 3 or 1 and 3, that lopsided sort of 2-to-1 ratio in the measure, and an equally divided measure. But because it's not an even meter, subdivision is harder to do at the beat level. So Bach maybe subdivides the chord progression over 2 beats, because the real harmonic rhythm of this measure is 1 and 3, and 2 is where the subdivision is happening. But then we go to C major, C, C, E, and E. Root position, tonic triad, 2 roots and 2 thirds. That's always an interesting spelling. And I think this is where we go to A minor, and this is now our 3 chord. I think any of these points could have, or any of these chords here could have been the point at which we modulated to the key of A minor. It doesn't really matter too much, but I think by the time we see G sharp, we will have already modulated. So somewhere in this measure. We then get B, D, G sharp, and D, which is G sharp diminished over B, which is 7-6, or we see this from time to time where 7 and 5 are contextualized with one another. If you hear this E as the root of the chord, this could be a 5-4-3 chord, a E7 chord in second inversion, but I think it's 6 of one, half dozen of another in this case, because 7-6 and 5-4-3 are basically the same chords, both in pitch content and in function. So I think, like I said, they both more or less accomplish the same function. But we do get some more transitive harmony here. Typically we would expect 7-6 to resolve to 1, and in the bass it does that, but we get a bit of a deceptive progression. We have A, we have F, we have A, and we have D. So this F and this D makes this a D minor chord over A, which is 4-6-4, so close to A minor, but two of the voices are a step away. We have F to E and D, a step away from C. But this then resolves to another dominant functioning chord. We have G sharp, E, B, and E, which is E major over G sharp, 5-6, and that takes us to A minor, A, E, A, and C, tonic triad root position. We then have E, E, A, and B. I think this A is a 4-3 suspension over our bass, which is sort of implying a 5 chord where the resolution is going to happen on the next beat. It's very common to see 4-3 suspensions over root position 5 chords in Bach's chorale writing. A is a little neighbor tone here, and then we have E, D, G sharp, and B. So by the time the resolution happens, the 7th gets introduced, so I'll go ahead and change the figured bass there before we get F major rather than A minor. The upper voices sort of allude to A minor, right? We have C, A, and A, but the bass is not A, it is F, making this F major, which is our submediant rather than our root, which is why this is a deceptive cadence. So for the next phrase, we're going to see a modulation to the key of G major, ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and we have a chromatic bass line here, which is kind of interesting. Typically when I see F sharp in like an A minor context, I would expect to see it like we saw here, like as part of an F sharp half diminished chord or a D major chord. And in this case, we go from F major to D major, and that sort of chromatic mediant relationship between the two chords does pose an interesting situation regarding where the modulation gets marked. But my intuition tells me that this 6th chord here, F, C, F, and A with this passing 7th is still in the key of A minor, and I'm going to say that this D major chord is also still in the key of A minor, or it's the point of transition between the two of them, where D major over F sharp, A, D, and D is a 4-6 chord in the key of A minor, and it is a 5-6 chord in the key of G major, which is an interesting way to do it, because typically speaking, when I see F going to F sharp, I would expect G, then G sharp, then A, sort of as this rising mixture. It's a chromatic bass line, but a rising mixture of A minor and A melodic minor. So I think Bach cuts it short and then keeps it in the key of G major, and that's where sort of the elision between the two keys happens. But yeah, it's hard to say exactly how the modulation's happening. It could just be a direct modulation to G major after the F major chord, but I think this makes the most sense to me the way I wrote it here. Passing 7th in the melody, that takes us to our tonic, G major, G, G, D, and B. We then have C major in root position, C, G, E, and C. It's our 4 chord. Then we have D, F sharp, D, and A. It's our 5 chord D major, passing 7th in the tenor this time, and then we have G major, G, G, B, and G, 3 roots, and 1/3 spelling. The next phrase quickly pivots to the key of A minor at the end with an imperfect authentic cadence, but we start off in the key of C major, kind of like the inverse of what happens in this phrase, where we start in A and then we go to C, but even more inverted by the fact that we stay in the key that we cadence in for longer here, whereas we see the key that we're going to cadence in basically at the end. So it's kind of the inverse in 2 ways when compared to the end of the A section. So I think we start off in the key of C major. This E minor chord here, E, B, E, and G, is 6 in the key of G major, and it is 3 in the key of C major. That's going to take us to A minor, so this is typically how the chords move, from 3 to 6 rather than from 6 to 3. A, C, oh apologies, oh no, this is right, this is a typo, apologies. This did not get fixed in the score, but it is accurate in the recording at the beginning. So A, C, E, and C. It's a 6 chord A minor, passing tones in the lower voices here with B and D, kind of like implying a little 7 chord here, or maybe even a 5 chord in first inversion. That then takes us to A minor in first inversion, C, E, A, and C, 6, 6. So yeah, these lower voices here, even though we don't have another voice to fully round out what this chord is intended to be, it could be a root position 7 chord, kind of functioning the way that this root position 6 chord is, or it could be first inversion 5 chord, kind of functioning how this 5 chord or how a 7 chord would typically function in between 2 1 chords. But after that, we go to B, D, G, and D, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, G major over B. Then we have A, C, G, and E, which is A minor 7 in root position, that's 6, 7, and that takes us to G major, G, B, G, and F. We've seen this progression before, right here, 5, 6, 6, 7, 5, 7. But here we see it in A minor, and here we see it in C major. So this phrase really does feel akin to what's going on here at the end of the A section in more ways than the two that I talked about at the beginning. We're seeing recycled progressions from that same phrase as well. So it takes us to C major, C, C, G, and E, which is our 3 chord in the key, I was thinking ahead there. It is our tonic triad in the key of C major, and in the key of A minor, it is our 3 chord. This passing F and this neighboring D here does kind of give us a D minor chord in first inversion. I will put that there, even though it's incompletely spelled and we've doubled the 7th here as 2, 4, 2. Or sorry, no, apologies. I'm not going to mark that because we would expect it would be a 2, 4, 2 chord in the key of C major, but it would be a 4, 4, 2 chord in the key of A minor. So I'm confusing the two keys there. So there is a little bit of maybe D minor 7 in third inversion happening here, but regardless, we do see 3 moving to 5, kind of similarly how we've seen it earlier. G sharp, B, E, and E. 5, 6 more specifically, E major over G sharp. And then we get A minor, A, C, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, next phrase does go over the bar line, but we do get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor here. Similar to how we had a D minor cadence in the chorale we analyzed yesterday as well. So we start off with F major, F, F, A, and C, which is our 6 chord in the key of A minor. And then we get a bit of an interesting progression, 6 going to 4. We do see it from time to time, but it's a relatively uncommon progression. D, A, and F, which I think is the point in which we modulate to the key of D minor as well. Actually, there's no real reason. I'm going to take that back and say that, actually, I don't know how I feel about this. I think that we could say that the modulation happens here, no problem, but I'm going to say after the passing tone, we see another D minor chord here anyways. F, D, A, and F, which is just taking the same D minor chord and inverting it. That's where I'm going to say the modulation happens. I think it's like minutia. It's a very minute detail. If we see 2 minor chords in progression, what makes the first one any more of a point in which a modulation should be analyzed than the second? Like, why is the first D minor any more D minor-like than the second? Because we're coming from the key of A minor and D minor is a pertinent chord in that key, I just don't see the reason why I would analyze the second one rather than the first one. Unless we saw some type of passing chromaticism that, even though it wasn't part of an entire chord, would imply that D minor was already the new key the chorale was in at that point. I think it's just a slight detail. Either of these points I think would be valid. It's happening some point over this bar. The modulation, that is. So we move to the second page, then we get, let me go ahead and straighten out these pages as well. We then have G, D, B flat, and E, E minor 7 flat 5 over G. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. A, D, F, wait, A, D, yeah, F and D, which is D minor over A, which is 1-6-4, A, C sharp, G, and E, which is 5-7, 1-6-4 going to 5-7. Some people analyze it with the bracket. That's how I learned how to do it. Sorry, the thing's way off the frame, or way out of the frame rather. And our perfect authentic cadence ends with D minor, D, A, F, and D. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, I'm just going to organize my notes real quick. Next phrase ends in one of those subdominant cadences that I was talking about, and this one feels very subdominant-like, where it doesn't even really feel like we leave the key of C, and it feels almost like we're ending on a 4 chord, but rather we're ending on a tonic triad in the key of F, or at least that's how I'm analyzing it, because I don't know if there's any scholarship describing cadences that sort of operate this way. So if you know a resource that talks about a 1 chord and then cadencing on a 4 chord, let me know. Typically it's the other way around. It's like an inverse plagal cadence, but this is what I'm going to call an imperfect authentic cadence, or a subdominant cadence in the key of C, or an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F. But we stay in the key of C, I think, from the very beginning, and I'm going to call this D minor chord our 2 chord, namely because it feels like it's part of a greater 2-5-1 progression, where, interestingly, all the chords are in root position as well. G, B, G, and D. That's our 5 chord, G major, and then C major, C, C, G, and E. Tonic triad, root position, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get A, C, A, and E. Our 6 chord, we've seen 1 going to 6 a couple of times in this chorale. We then have D minor, D, A, F, and F. That's our 2 chord. Typically we see 6 go to 2. And we have passing 7th in the bass in this A here, which is a chord tone, before we get an interesting progression. Typically speaking, I've talked at length in the past about my opinion about 2 to 7 progressions out of all of the permutations of predominant and dominant chords, where predominant chords being 2, 4, really any chord that doesn't serve a dominant function, and the second chord being a dominant chord, which is typically 5 and 7. 2 going to 7 is probably the weakest permutation because the chords are a third apart, therefore they share 2 tones in common. So the only thing that's getting introduced is the leading tone, and that's that B right here. We have B, we have D, we have A, and we have F. So I think in a roundabout way we have a B minor 7 flat 5 here. So this is a root position 2 chord to a root position 7-7 chord, which is very interesting. I don't think I've encountered this progression in the chorales, and if I have, it's been a long time. And it's happened so infrequently that I don't even remember it happening. But 2 going to 7 is typically a very rare progression, and really there's nothing veiling this one. It's 2 going to 7, albeit I'd say the one thing maybe separating these 2 progressions from one another is the fact that there may be, going right here, there's the potential for there to be a C, C, A, and F chord, which would be like a 4-6-4 chord, and 4 typically goes to 7, but I feel like that's a bit of a stretch because, I don't know, it just doesn't really, with the counterpoint going on, we have the A and the F, which I guess are important contextual tones for F major. Just with the voices sort of moving in this sparse nature, the bass is moving on every beat in the measure. The tenor and the melody are matching each other rhythmically, and there's a syncopation going on. In the alto, it doesn't really feel like this chord progression has as strong of a position in the phrase, but technically speaking, I guess there is a bit of a buffer in between the 2 and the 7 chord here. So if you hear the 4 chord here, that's great, and it does sort of explain the 7 chord happening after the 2, but I didn't quite hear it that way when I was listening to the chorale for my own analytical purposes. But after the 7 chord, we have E, D, G, and G, which is like a 3-7 chord in root position. So typically we would expect this to resolve to 1, but we're seeing it resolve to 3 instead, and that follows the cycle of falling fifths. 7 does resolve to 3 a fair amount as well. I just find Bach more often resolves it to 1 and uses it as more of like a dominant sort of tonic pair. But then afterwards we have D, B, G, and G. Again, 3 going to 5 here. In this case it's 5, 4, 3. It's actually, it's interesting, when we do see 3 go to 5, it is often to 5, 4, 3, which is curious. This F's a little delayed passing 7th. And then we get, 5, 6, 4. 5, 6, 4 and 5, 4, 3 are kindred spirits. They're both second inversion chords. You could hypothetically call this a 5, 4, 3 chord depending on how you look at this F. And with 3 going to 5, it is often that 3 goes to 5, 4, 3, so maybe that F is an important contextual tone, but that was going to resolve to C major in root position. C, C, G, and E, which also happens to be the 5 chord in the key of F. After this passing tone in the melody, we do get our tonic, our tonic, F, C, A, and C. It really does feel like this is operating more as 4 in the key of C major, but the reason why this kind of feels like a brief modulation to the key of F in the same way that we modulated to A earlier also coincides with the fact that we are going to be modulating not back to C, but we're going to be modulating to G major. There's going to be a distant modulation from F to G, just like in yesterday's harmonization of this melody. So we start off with C major, C, C, G, and E, which is our 5 chord, a little passing 7th in the tenor as well, but remember this is not a B flat like we would expect it to be natural, so probably this is operating like 4 in the key of G major. And we also have F sharp on the next beat, so that's typically a giveaway that we're going to see a modulation or some type of tonicization. That's context based, but yeah, in this case it's a modulation. In this case it's D major over F sharp, A, and D. That's 5, 6. We'll passing 7th in the melody here before we get G, D, G, and B, which is our tonic triad G major. And apologies for the phrase ending on the beginning of the beat there. I swear when I print it, it doesn't say it's going to do that, and then it prints a different version of the score, which frustrates me. But yeah, just the phrase ends on the beginning of the next system. It's a little peeve of mine, but it's happened a handful of times in the videos, so sorry if that's difficult to follow. Anywho, after our tonic triad, we have E, C, G, and C. It's another C major chord, this time in first inversion. We then get C, E, G, and A. Kind of an interesting progression here. 4 going to 2. They're both similar in function, so it kind of feels like this is just one big predominant idea, A minor 7 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. We would expect this to go to 5, which it does. D, D, F sharp, and A. Little passing 7th in the tenor, and then we have our perfect authentic cadence here in the key of G major, where we cadence on 1, G, B, D, and G. Next phrase has a similar profile as the one that we saw in yesterday's chorale as well, where we have a sort of arguable, ambiguous cadence where this could, granted there's an F sharp at the end of it, so it could be an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of G. I hear it as a half cadence in the key of C with a little secondary dominant passing chord before our primary dominant in the key of C. So I think this G major chord, similar to where metrically the previous phrase that we just analyzed, modulated, this is sort of operating as a chord other than the one it was in the previous phrase. So it's our tonic in the key of G, we don't need to reanalyze, but with this F natural I feel like we are modulating back to the key of C, and this is now our 5 chord. And just like how this B natural is not B flat like we would expect if we were staying in the key of F, this F natural is not F sharp, which is what we would expect in the key of G. So it's a clear indicator that we've modulated or are tonicizing something. But then we get C major in first inversion, E, G, E, and C, 1-6. We have D, D, F, and C. It's kind of like a little 2-7 chord here. But I think even more interestingly than the little passing 2-7 chord that is incomplete like we had on the previous page, this D is supposed to be an E, which also got improperly copied. Apologies about that. We have C, E, G, and B. What is this doing here? We have a root position tonic 7 chord. It's really interesting. We don't see tonic 7th chords with a lot of frequency at all. We have 1-6 with this like sort of passing, maybe, I don't know, it could potentially be a 7-6 chord with this C being held over, this pattern that we've seen quite a bit in this chorale. Going to a tonic 7 chord. Typically I'd expect this to be a B flat and then we'd resolve to F major, but I think that that's sort of the logic that Bach has here. Instead of this being a dominant 7 chord, the chord still is a fifth away from 4 and has a tendency via the cycle of falling fifths to resolve to 4, F, A, C, and A, but it's not operating as its dominant, it's just a fifth away, which I think is interesting. But yeah, that tonic 7th is really interesting. F, B, D, and A. It's like a little passing 7-4-3 chord. I believe we saw one of these earlier as well, and this resolves to C major. It's common for us to see this sort of subdivided, I guess in, like I was talking about earlier, triple meter subdivided chord progression is not the easiest to discern, like, is this a subdivision, or is this a passing chord, or is this not a passing chord and the harmonic rhythm is on every beat. It's hard to say. I typically look at the bass if there's going to be some type of harmonic rhythm, and I should also mark these as well. What was I saying? Yes, 1-6, C major over E, E, C, E, and G. And that takes us to D, B, F, and D, which is B diminished over D. That is 7-6, and we would expect that to take us to our tonic C, C, E, and E, which it does. 1-6, 7-6, 1. Very common pattern in Bach, and it's also been a pattern that's been varied quite a bit in this chorale in particular, which is pretty cool. This D is a little neighbor tone, and then we get C, A, E, and E, which in defense of this being an imperfect authentic cadence, this would be 2-6 in the key of G major, but I do think this is operating as 6-6 in the key of C major, and this is just a little brief passing secondary dominant with the F sharp and the D, making this 5-4-2 of 5 with the C in the bass. And granted, we usually see 4-2 chords resolved down by step, and the root is typically a fifth away, and the root happens to be a fifth away here. We are seeing D resolve to G, G, B, G, and D, so we do get our 5 chord here. This is a roundabout way of saying 5-4-2 going to 1, but we typically would expect it to go to 1-6, where C resolves down to B. I don't think you should definitely take this that commentary with a grain of salt, though, because of the fact that the bass is being held. It's like being sustained for like a longer period of time, and we're not seeing the bass move with the same level of activity as the other voices. If all the voices were moving with like more equity, like more just rhythmic homogeneity between them, I think it would be more of something to look into, but I think that this C being in the bass here is a little bit more coincidental, and it also, I think, strengthens the argument of this being a half cadence, where this looks more like 1 going to 5, and the other chords that are happening on top of it are common tone chords, basically. Maybe the C is even just a pedal. But this does take us to our last cadence, where we stay in the key of C, or we will have modulated back to the key of C, depending on if you think this last little cadence here is in the key of G major. But yeah, it's straightforward. C major, C, C, G, and E, which I feel satisfies our resolution from our half cadence. We then have A, C, F, and F, which is 4/6, F major over A, G, C, G, and E, which is 1/6/4, C major over G. Then we get F, B, G, and D, G7 over F, which is 5/4/2, and we typically expect this to resolve to 1/6, E, C, G, and C. 1/6/4 going to 5/4/2 going to 1/6 is a progression that we saw on the previous page as well. Anticipation here in the melody, that takes us to F, C, A, and D. D minor 7 over F. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. That takes us to G major, G, B, G, and D. Little anticipation here in the melody, and then we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad in root position. And that is today's analysis. A couple of points to take home, not too much in comparison to the length of the chorale, but a couple of usual suspects that we see in Bach's writing. There's a chromatic bass line that we saw here with F, F sharp, and G. Maybe there was even another later on. I don't think so. I think that was the only chromatic bass line, I think. We have a mid-phrase modulation with A going to C, C going to A. Couple of mid-phrase modulations in this chorale. C going to F. Sorry, you can't see that from my vantage point. C, or I could only see it from my vantage point. C going to F. Maybe even C going to G here if you saw this as a modulation. What else? A potential 2 going to 7 progression here if this passing 4/6 chord is not really enough evidence for you to mark it down, but the more that I think about it, the more it makes sense, because we typically would expect 4 to go to 7 anyways, and Bach is known to include buffers in between chords that have similar pitch content or chords that have similar functions, which those are usually 2 in the same. We have a distant modulation from F to G. What else? We have a potential tonic 7th going on here, which is interesting. Oh, sorry, right here. Tonic 7th with C, E, G, and B. Very fascinating. And then we have a potential sort of irregular 4/2 resolution here, where, you know, it is happening on the end of the beat, and the C feels more like sort of like an anchor rather than it feels like a standalone bass for this chord. Specifically, if C was introduced in the bass as the other tones were introduced, I think it'd be more to talk about, but here there's some potential for argument that the 4/2 chord isn't resolving the way you would expect. But I think that's all I want to talk about in today's chorale, so I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.